So this is a familiar story. I'm sure know one like it. There's a hot-headed millennial who posts some gripes on a social media wall. I mean, all he was asking for really was a meeting, and something about the tone of the post set people off. And you know what happened? It got forwarded to his boss, and then that got forwarded to his boss, and then that got forwarded to his boss, and pretty soon the whole thing went viral. And that is how we got that. The Protestant Reformation. "33-year-old Martin Luther didn't just handwrite those 95 theses and tack them on the Wittenberg door. By all accounts, he was kind of an early adopter of the new technology of the day, which was what? Printing press, right? And he enlisted another young Wittenberg entrepreneur, Johann Grunenberg, who happened to own the new technology, I suppose in his dorm room or something. And not only did they print the 95 theses, but they made copies, right? They had copies of this, which is how Archbishop Albert of Brandenburg, and then the theologians at Mainz, and then the Pope Leo X, and pretty soon most of Germany got their hands on Luther's writing so fast. In fact, Luther went one better and then made a German translation of it. Anyway, like the young adults in our churches, Martin Luther he looked at the problems of the church, and then he leveraged the technology of his day to try to solve them. Or maybe you've heard of this guy, Émile Loray, 1993. He's a French electrician. He's driving across the desert in Morocco, and he gets to a checkpoint that says, "Do not pass go. Don't go past here, it's dangerous." And of course, he goes past there. And about 20 miles into the desert, he breaks the axle of the car, and it's undrivable. And so now he's got a problem. So he can't drive the car. He quickly deems that it's undrivable. He knows the terrain pretty well. He's been through this area before, and he knows that he is at least 20 miles from the nearest village. And he knows he can't walk that far. So what are some of his options? What are some things that you think he might do? Throw some out. He can stay with the car. He can pray. He can run. What else? He could hitchhike. Now think about this in terms of what your church would do. If you were aware that there were some rough terrain ahead, you decided to go forward anyway, and then the bottom fell out. What are some options that you might have at your disposal? You could stay with what you're already doing. You could pray. You could run. Okay, so what he does, right? He's got what he has in the car is he does have some water with him, and he has his electrician's tools with him. Okay, so what he winds up doing is he takes the body off the car, and he sleeps under it for a few days, 12 days to be exact. And he spends the next 12 days reconfiguring the parts of the car to make that. And then he drives it into the nearest town, where he promptly gets a ticket for not having a proper motorcycle license. Which goes to show you that even if you do hack the resources that you have to come up with something new and innovative, somebody's going to penalize you for it. So if you were going to be looking at 1 Chronicles 12:32, I know that was probably on your quiet time this morning because everybody does Chronicles for that. What's going on here is that David is preparing for the battle with Saul, and it Chronicles, because it's Chronicles, is listing all the provisions that all of the tribes of Israel are bringing to bear on this battle, and it goes through all long list of all the provisions that are offered. The tribe of Reuben brings all these warriors, and the tribe of Judah brings all of these, horses and armor, and somebody else brings all of this metallurgy, and they get to the tiny tribe of Issachar, just 200 strong. And what we read about the children of Issachar is that they understood the times and they understood what to do. In other words, what they had to offer for this battle was wisdom. And for whatever reason, the person chronicling all of these provisions for the battle decided that wisdom was at least as valuable as all of the armor and all of the horses and all of the warriors that the other people were offering this battle. And they knew that that wisdom was going to be significant in David's ability to defeat Saul. This is the provision that we need as well. We also need the ability to understand the times, to understand what we should do to respond right now. As you probably have gathered right now, I consider right now the church's best opportunity that we have probably had since Martin Luther to be reshaped into the kind of church that God has called us to be. I don't think there has been a more creative time to be in ministry, at least since I've been in ministry. Our foundation is secure, but boy, the bolts are pretty loose. And there's a new generation of designers and builders who stand at the ready. The only question that this new generation of, this entrepreneurial spirit with this new generation forces us to reckon with is this question. Just how much of what we have learned to call church are we willing to let go of in order to follow Jesus? So for example, consider these. I'm going to show you a couple of videos here real quick. Just watch. One or both of those are churches that have been started kind of organically by groups of millennials. The first one is Gastro Church. It's a dinner church in Houston, which takes place in a lot of the apartment complexes. It's United Methodist Church, which is one reason I know it. And the second one is it's a nationwide movement called the Dinner Party, which is 20 and 30-somethings that get together around a meal of home-cooked food at somebody's house. And what they have in common is that they have all lost someone close to them. And over dinner, they share their journeys, spiritual or otherwise. Now, it's a little hard to tell, right? What is a church? What isn't a church? What makes these communities form? What brings them together? They're both addressing deeply spiritual needs. For example, consider a few others. You might have heard of the Sunday Assembly, right? These people gather together to celebrate life across cities in the United States. They sing pop songs, they listen to a speaker, they stay for tea and cake, they volunteer. These are for people who are disassociated from religious communities. It's church for people who don't believe anything in particular. I don't know if you've heard of the Robloxian Christians. It is a Christian community pastored by an 11-year-old, well, it was started by an 11-year-old boy. He's 16 now. It has 4,500 members. It's an online game of Roblox. These little Lego-like Christian people are the avatars there. That's Daniel. They celebrated Easter, all of the Easter services. You might notice down here, this was the Holy Thursday service, I think, and the pastor has said, God is good, and all the people, you can kind of see it say, all the time, right? That's Daniel now, he's 16. Right? Consider the fact that there are an astonishing number of seminary graduates using their MDivs to be yoga instructors and run CrossFit gyms. Meanwhile, the MDiv itself is in free fall. There is one, I'll come back to that. Anybody heard of Camp Grounded? It looks a whole lot like church camp, but it's summer camp for adults, specifically for millennials in Silicon Valley. And one of the things they do all the things that, summer camp does, but one of the things they're really big on is disconnecting to reconnect. So you can see all of the signs they have to remind you that you are not to have your cell phones on. No, I can't remember what this stands for. I can't see it. What does the WMD stand for? Wireless mobile devices, right? And all these signs there to remind you. And analog dating night is fascinating to me. That's one of the things that happens at camp. At least they name that dating night happens at camp. I don't know about your experiences with camp. There's a lot of informal, yeah, yeah, right? All right. One of the most popular podcasts among young adults right now is Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Do you know about this? Where you read Harry Potter as a sacred text, and it's founded by a Harvard Divinity School graduate. So we can go into this, but basically what they're saying is, what if we read books that we love as sacred texts? They actually have practices of Lectio Divina and Ignatian practices around Harry Potter. Has a very faithful following. Go Fish is the summer employment program for middle-high kids on the Columbia River. The Washington Fish and I love this story. The Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission pays $8 a fish to catch pike minnows that threaten the salmon hatcheries. So it's also Presbyterian pastor Matt McNally's ministry. So this is a guy that we work with. Mark DeVries and I work with him through Ministry Incubators. And what happened was the church cut back Matt's hours to save money, and Matt convinced them to buy a pontoon boat from the Lutherans down the street. I know, what? Whatever. Anyway, so the deal was he wanted to teach kids how to fish during the summer, and he has a few, relevant Bible stories to tell. And after they spend all summer fishing on a boat together, Matt knows more kids than anybody else in town. The church now buys into Go Fish as their primary means for evangelism because parents cannot stop bringing their kids to Matt's boat because they want to learn how to fish, and they all get paid, right? Plus, the church gives Matt an extra 6 weeks before the kids are out of school so that he can get paid as well. The police also use Matt as their go-to chaplain. Okay, now you tell me. What is the church? The point is that the church as we know it is way beyond tweaking. North American faith communities can no longer pretend to influence the marketplace from outside of the marketplace. And we can't influence the broader culture by simply doing what we have done before, only better. A reformation is in order. A hacking of the church as we know it, a reconfiguring of our constituent parts, brought into being by this necessity of the now that calls into being shapes we have not yet imagined, except that they seem capable of carrying us into our next point on our journey towards God. Yesterday, we talked about some of the medieval monasteries that pioneered certain practices so as not to burden the poor. And we had kind of an interesting conversation about sodalities and modalities in the Q&A period, which I think bears some further digging. And if we fast forward another 800 years, there was another entrepreneurial young adult named Francis who revised some of these monastic practices because by then the issue was no longer sustainability, but abuse because obscene wealth had become a problem. Benedict's entrepreneurial vision, at that point, was based on the same honest impulse that young adults have now. Garrison Keillor, I think, summed it up: give up your good Christian life and follow Jesus. But it also has kind of a downside, which I think might make it less of an option than many people in our age think. On the surface, what's not to love about Benedict, right? A lot of things that are good there. These are one of many of the things in Benedict's rule that we want to champion. He welcomed people into the monastery with little or no religious background, or frankly, with little religious interest for that matter, so that they could learn to live together. What's not to love about that? So far, so good. But then, one of the things Benedict advised was this: if it can be done, the monastery should be so situated that all the necessities, such as water and the mill and the garden, are enclosed, and the various arts may be plied inside the monastery, so there may be no need for the monks to go about outside, because it is not at all good for their souls. And if a brother would go on a journey outside the monastery, it further says, he is not to relate to the others what he hath seen or heard outside the monastery, because it is most hurtful, under penalty of the rule. And, sneaking out, boy, that was not allowed. Not unless the abbot ordered it. Okay, I'm going to leave to historians whether that was good advice in Benedict's time. I don't think it makes much sense in ours. Such withdrawal is actually the very opposite of the call to the church in an apostolic age. So however unsupported we might feel by Christendom, Donald Trump is not Nero. Now, however queasy he makes you feel, and I'm on record as one of the people he makes pretty queasy, but we are not living in the fall of Rome. We're really not. And the reason we are searching for Issachar is not because the faith of American young people is threatened by forces outside the church, but because forces inside the church are just not strong enough to make a difference to them. We have compelling data to point to the fact that American churches themselves have failed to translate our faith to another generation, making it almost impossible for our own children to distinguish us, their parents, from any of the other nice people they know. These are the times that we're struggling to understand so we know what to do. Times in which Christian spirituality has failed to make enough of a dent in the world for young people, frankly, to notice. That is not Benedict's problem, it's ours. Now, the upshot is, young people are not waiting for us, the established churches of Christendom, who for the last 200 or 2,000 years have been building booths or buildings to capture the moment when Christ was first illumined for us to address their spiritual concerns. For the record, I don't think all those examples I just gave are churches. But I don't blame young people for trying to form communities of meaning and purpose when those things we call religious communities are not places that offer meaning and purpose for them. There's a whole new body of research that's emerging around what's loosely being called new spiritual communities. These new spiritual communities actually address very old spiritual concerns. They help young people find meaning and purpose. They sort of are promising finding some kind of transformation, maybe a key to the flourishing life. But what they're doing is they're finding effective ways of affecting the world with like-minded others in concrete situations that have eluded them in more established situations. And whether they're religious or secular, sorry, I'm ahead of my slides. Those people who are beginning to study them have found very interestingly similar impulses that are driving these kinds of new spiritual communities. So these are completely unrelated studies, but both a Jewish study and the work that's happening out of the Fetzer Institute now, but it began at Harvard Div School, on young adult spiritual communities, found these same spirit impulses driving the establishment of new spiritual communities. And you can see they're pretty similar: deep community, purpose and vocation, social transformation, individual creativity, personal accountability, personal transformation. And in the Jewish study, they found religious practices. The Jewish study critiques the Harvard study for not acknowledging the fact that some young people actually do want to stay tethered to religious tradition and communities. Now, many of these young spiritual entrepreneurs are creating communities apart from existing spiritual groups, or at least apart from the spiritual communities that raised them. They're not economically driven, but they're not ignoring entrepreneurship either. They're just basically looking at how to make their communities work and using whatever economic options are available to them to do that. So these leaders are kind of creating these undertakings in between that we talked about yesterday. They're kind of filling in spiritual gaps in between the spaces that are in between the existing religious options available to them. And in December, the Fetzer Institute brought together 80 of these religious leaders, of these new communities. Half of them were Christian, half of them were not religious. Including leaders of many of the groups that I just described. And some pretty interesting insights emerged from that. First of all, what these religious or non-religious, Christian or non-Christian leaders had in common was they all felt like they had more in common with each other than from the religious traditions they came from. They felt like they had found their tribe with each other in these new spiritual communities. Second, when they were asked, what would you like more of? What came out was they would like more time with each other, and they would like more training in spiritual practices and spiritual traditions, which is interesting, right? And at the moment, they're collecting coaches for people to actually coach some of these leaders. And the third thing, which was really interesting, is when they kind of dug down on who these religious leaders were, these spiritual entrepreneurs were, they were not young people who had grown up on the fringes of their religious traditions. Actually, on the contrary, they tended to be among the most religiously formed in their traditions. They were young people who had grown up going to their religious camps. They attended religious youth groups. They participated in the religious formation programs of their traditions. In fact, they were among the best and the brightest of their faith traditions. They loved the spirituality of their traditions by and large. But they discovered for various reasons that they could not find themselves in those traditions anymore as they grew older. And so with varying degrees of distance from the mothership, from their home tradition, some became ordained and some left altogether. They went out and founded spiritual communities that fit them. So these young adults are posing provocative questions about the church and discipleship and what it looks like in the future, challenging us to come clean about what we're willing to hold on to and what we have to let go of in the name of following Jesus in an apostolic age. There's not much research on these communities. From here on out, we're just going to have to explore some hunches. And yeah, they're pretty much my hunches, more than data on what this might mean for the church going forward. And the attempt is just to understand these times a little better and to maybe get a reading on what we might do as a result. So I'm going to suggest that we might be seeing some shifting ecclesial terrain in three ways. And I'm going to call them flipped, fuzzy, and fresh, okay? I think one of the things that we're going to see more of with these new spiritual communities is something that I'm going to call flipped church. And this is pretty common within established church communities. And what I mean by flipped church is that it reverses the usual approach to young people's ministries. Instead of churches using students as cheap labor to accomplish our ministries, we come along young people to help them accomplish theirs, okay? So the theological thrust in this is vocation. Flipped church is all about helping young people discover their God-given gifts, incubating these gifts, giving them the social capital and the spiritual capital that Chap talked about yesterday to help them live into those gifts. And sometimes we do this in the service of their ministries. And sometimes we do this because when we encounter young people utilizing their gifts well, we see God more clearly, okay? So, a couple examples. Nate Hartley is 17. He's in outside of Chicago. And the thing is with Nate is dyslexic, and he's in one of those school districts outside of Chicago where it's all about what college you're going to get into, right? It's a high-performing kind of college-driven kind of school district. And at one point, about 2 years ago, he goes to his parents and he says, you know what? I'm just never going to succeed by these measures. And I want to do something I'm good at. Well, his parents, to his credit, backed him. And so what Nate said were those magic words in a flipped church kind of setting. The magic words are, what if? And Nate said, what if? And he explained this vision he had for employing people who, like him, wouldn't succeed by normal measures of success in the job market. He wanted to give people with Down syndrome in his town jobs that paid a living wage. And his idea was to start with his youth group at church. With the help of some adults from their congregation who could teach them how to set up a business, could help provide some lumber and some tools, Nate had his friends building picture frames, and then they employed people from a local sheltered workshop to paint them and insert magnetic boards. They basically built these magnetic frames, and they had people decorating magnets, and so they sold them at craft shows and on the internet. And they built a company called Uniquely Able. Not only did it employ local residents with Down syndrome, but they became recognized as one of Chicago's leading advocates for disabled workers. Megan Barnes was 23 when a church in Iowa hired her to work with girls, and what they wanted her to do was to help bring together the racially divided communities in their town. Yeah, we want you to work with girls and solve racism. Go, right? And, she's like, geez, how do you do that? So what she wound up doing was she pulled together some girls that represented some of these various communities in the town, and she did what you do. She goes, I don't know how to solve this problem. What do you think we should do? And the girls started with, well, what if? What if we baked pies? So they started a pie bakery. And TriPie now employs 8 girls from across the community, and they have 1 full-time paid staff member. Megan's position is still paid for by the church. Each girl makes about $40 a week by being part of the program. They meet 2 days a week after school. On one day, they do what amounts to ramped-up confirmation and discipleship training. On the other day, they do job training, life skills, and they bake pies. And it's an ancient form of Christian community, right? Where prayer and work go hand in hand. Lex orandi, lex operandi. So what makes this flipped church? Think about the way we normally approach young adult and youth ministry. We normally bring somebody like us in, and because we've got all this training and expertise, we dream up all these activities designed to involve young people. And then we spend the rest of our time convincing young people that they want to be involved in the activities that we've just dreamed up for them, right? Or we plan important ministries that are necessary for churches to be involved in. And then we use young people as the labor to accomplish the ministries that we have planned. Flipped church reverses that. And the church says to young people, what ministry is God calling you to? How can we come alongside you to help that happen? And sometimes, and this is the counterintuitive part, we come alongside young people and help them use their God-given gifts anyway, whether or not they even think those gifts come from God. Sometimes we do that just because we say to them, look, your gifts help us see God more clearly, and we'd love to celebrate them and help you use them. And this is kind of what Elizabeth Gilbert, I don't know if you've seen her TED Talk on creativity, but this is kind of what she was talking about when she describes this. She talks about the Sufi dancers in the Moors doing these dances where there's the whirling dervishes, they're spinning. And she says every now and then, one of them, they've done this dance 1,000 times before, but every now and then one of them something transcendent would happen. They would seem to step through sort of a portal, and they would just be magnificent and lit up with what seemed to be divine. And the audiences, the Moorish audiences, would notice that, and they would start chanting as this dancer danced, and they would start chanting and put their hands together and clap and say, Allah, 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 God, 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 which later got shortened into Ole, 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 which means, there it is, I see it. God, 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 I see it in you, a glimpse of God. Fuzzy church. Mike Bachman is a United Methodist pastor of a church plant in Dallas called Union. It's also a coffee shop that regularly is among the top coffee shops as people vote for them in Dallas. They give away 10% of their proceeds to local charities. They've got a popular storytelling stage there. And in fact, one night a month, they become a cape-making factory that sews superhero capes for chronically ill kids in local hospitals. That's kind of a flipped church idea, actually, because that was an idea that came to them through 2 nursing students. Now, I said it's a church because they have worship and communion a couple times a week, and it's a faith home, especially for young adults who didn't think they were religious. One of them actually is now getting her MDiv at Princeton, and she's going to be the intern at my church next fall. We'll come back to that. Another example of this came from Erica Liu and Mark Elsden, who went straight from seminary to the Presbyterian campus ministry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Like a lot of campus ministries, it turned out to be on life support when they got there. They had a cavernous chapel, virtually no students to work with, and a dispirited board of directors, empty parking lot in the middle of campus. And they were too new and too inexperienced to realize this was a terrible idea. They said, let's build a dorm. The board, who was too close to shutting the whole thing down to worry that it was a terrible idea, said, okay. So Today, Pres House, as they call it, which is that large structure you see there, is built on the parking lot next to the chapel. It's a dynamic worshiping community led by students and by young adults. It's a student apartment community in the heart of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's campus. It's home to 200 students, including multiple intentional communities, a sober living community, a veteran student community, a Christian faith and service corps, and a whole bunch of others. This past year, Pres House paid off its mortgage, which means that it will generate revenue from student leases of $1 million a year that will be used to fund that ministry for perpetuity. So what makes these Union and Pres House fuzzy churches? Because the line where church ends and enterprise begins is so hard to discern that even the tax code is confused. The theological thrust here is community and mission. Sharing life together is key, and living that life together for the sake of others is central to the community's identity. And Union, or any of the thousands of other coffee shop churches out there serving a missional purpose, the question is it a congregation? Is it a coffee shop? Is it a performance venue? Is it a cake-making nonprofit? Yes, right? Is Pres House a dorm? Is it a student activity center? Is it a campus ministry? Or is it a congregation? Yes, right? Social enterprises all have fuzzy borders in this regard. Pres House in particular has had to fight to keep their religious exemption in the tax code. It is still tax exempt to the chagrin of other apartment complexes in town who've taken it to court. Twice its status as a church has been upheld. I don't know how long that'll last. The theological critique, of course, is that these marketplace churches risk being subsumed by consumerism, being really co-opted by the dominant culture. The irony, of course, is that the young people leading these communities experience them in precisely the opposite way, because they intentionally employ business models that stand in such stark contrast to the business culture around them, like the fusion of life and ministry, and they give away 10% of their profits, stuff like that. Marketplace churches often more visibly operate as contrast communities than congregations do. And that makes their work seem more starkly in contrast to the culture around them. The last example, by the way, I think there are probably a lot of different kinds of ecclesial permutations that we might see. I can think of some others, but I'm going to go with one that's fairly well established here, which goes by the name of the Fresh Expressions movement. This started in the UK. Some of you were probably familiar with this in 2004. It's basically church for people who are unfamiliar with church. A couple examples of this. For most nights, Reverend Michael Plank does more burpees than Bible studies because he and his wife own a CrossFit church in a Rust Belt town in New York. And this church doubles as a worshiping community. Similarly, there's a church in Ocala, Florida that locates part of its ministry in a local tattoo parlor. And like a lot of the Robloxian Christians, these churches, they fit the fresh expression movement in spirit, if not in name. This movement, as I said, started in the UK. It's made some inroads in the US, but not without some significant theological losses, which I'm going to come back to in just a second. Let me tell you how this got started. In 2004, the Anglican Bishops' Report, and surprise bestseller. Have you read a Bishop's Report? I mean, this is not something that makes the bestseller list. But the document's original title, which was ditched for marketing reasons, is nonetheless theologically significant. They originally called it Dying to Live. And the report revealed remarkable institutional courage because it basically declared the Anglican bishops' willingness to let the institutional forms of the Anglican Church in the UK die if it meant they could help people unfamiliar with the church come to know Christ in new ways. So that's how Fresh Expressions became Christian communities established for people unfamiliar with church. The theological thrust is mission. And in some cases, we could call that evangelism, although in the UK they call it mission. And it takes root after long periods of time living and listening in particular contexts to discern where Christ is already moving. And then what happens is that there'll be often a lay or an ordained, they call them pioneers. Often these people are bivocational, so you can see where the practices of social innovation come into play here. They form teams of people to discern how in that community might be the best way to take part in what God is already up to there. The result is not unlike the apostolic movement in the 2nd century, because some fresh expression communities wind up looking like traditional congregations, some wind up looking like schools or child care centers or social enterprises, and many look like what they call third spaces. And third spaces or third places are social environments beyond work or home that are established for civic engagement and to foster inclusiveness. And sometimes they also provide, media theorist Stephen Johnson says these places, because they foster social connection, they are also places that foster social innovation. The idea of a third place is especially important for the Fresh Expressions movement. I don't know whether you are familiar with Ray Oldenburg's work, but he coined this phrase in 1989, that at the risk of sounding mystical, he says, I will contend that nothing contributes to somebody's sense of belonging to a community as much as membership in a third place. It does more than membership in a dozen formal organizations. And you can probably think of in your own life, of the third spaces that are important to your own sense of belonging in a community if you've moved someplace. These are characteristics of third places according to Oldenburg. And just take a look at that list and think about your own congregation and compare that list to what membership in your own congregation involves. Because a lot of times, congregations, which are not first spaces, which are our homes, and they're not second spaces, which are our work, but a lot of times congregations are not comfortably third places either. They're more like formal membership organizations, which don't really foster places of belonging. And so what a third place is more like what those of you who remember the sitcom Cheers, that would be a classic third place or third space. But today's young people experience Twitter or Instagram as the place where everybody knows your name, right? And in Western culture generally, digital communication and networked individualism have displaced the neighborhood as the place you run into people. And when that is uncoupled from geography, a third place becomes even more important to culture. So Fresh Expressions is one of the places where Protestantism is taking seriously what ministry looks like in a world of ubiquitous connection. And its future in the U.S. is still unfolding. But here's one of the things where we have not followed the pattern of the bishops in the UK. In the UK, what the bishops said basically was, look, we were wrong. We were wrong to legislate so closely the work of the Holy Spirit in terms of what the church can look like. So as your bishops, we're getting out of the gatekeeping business and into the blessing business. And if you see a need that God is calling you to fulfill and you've got an idea for how to do it, we're going to bless it. And if you want to call it the church, fine with us. Now, in the U.S., where denominations split like amoeba and anybody can start a church who wants to, that doesn't sound like a big deal. In the Anglican context, it was revolutionary. But in the U.S., what we didn't do was risk anything. Remember, in the UK, they were dying to live. They were willing to say, we're going to give up our institutional form in order for this to happen. In the U.S., there was no theological reflection that took place for that to happen. There was no group that said, we're going to stop being the church as we know it in order for this to take place. And so what happens is Fresh Expressions winds up just being kind of another creative form of church planting. And I mention that simply because I think theological formation is urgently necessary in this landscape of shifting ecclesiology. Because if we don't have it, we might inadvertently create a generation of opportunistic pragmatists or thoughtful sociologists to lead churches. Or perhaps we're simply going to start a new social gospel movement that benignly assumes a level of Christian formation that we can no longer assume, and that people will assume a kind of Christian identity as they go forward, that we can implicitly just ignore formation without being attentive to it. That is not what Issachar would advise, and it's not what the times call for. In fact, I think exactly the opposite. What the times call for is not more excellent blacksmiths, but leaders of new spiritual communities that are, in the words of Greg Jones, traditioned innovators, not precise technocrats, but well-formed souls. Character and competence both matter. Those of us who form leaders in the church have to form Miles Davis and Sherlock Holmes and Kimmy Schmitz. We have to form leaders who know Scripture well enough to improvise without losing their way back to the melody. They have to know the divine imprint on creation well enough to dust for fingerprints amidst the clutter of daily life and be able to spot a counterfeit immediately because they're so intimately acquainted with the original. And they have to have some practical resilience, some postmodern bounce. They have to know how to read a budget and do design thinking, and they have to know how to create an economically sustainable action plan and have the agility to pivot when the situation calls for it. Because the churches they lead will be shapeshifters. Their hospitality will be more like Airbnb than Holiday Inn. Their activities will be more like Snapchat than Facebook. Their mission will be more like a barn raising than a van trip. The people that these spiritual innovators are going to lead will be far more ambivalent about their faith, about the church, about God than any generation before them. And as leaders, they're going to share much of their parishioners' ambivalence. In short, they're going to have a far more fluid conception of the church than any generation of Americans before them, and they will lead American Christianity into its next century. This actually gives me hope. We might get unstuck after all. So what if? What if word got out that if you got a dream to pursue and a vocation to live out, and if you want to turn the world upside down and you need help doing it, what if word got out that the place to go, the place you're going to find advisors and support and investors and space and cheerleaders and people to practice on is the church? What if young adults came to believe that the people committed to healing the world hung out in churches? And in fact, if you hang out around those people very long, they'll tell you why they're so into it. They'll celebrate it. They'll sing about it. They'll tell you ancient stories about it, especially on Sunday mornings. But in the meantime, whatever gifts you bring, whatever harebrained idea you have for making the world better, the people you can count on being committed to you, the people who will believe you into believing in yourself, the people who will be creative enough to be in your corner are the Christians. What if this were your church's reputation in your community? I can't think of anything that Easter people are more called to be than incubators of new life. But that means we're going to have to get pretty serious about what this incubator business is all about. And we're not long past all those bunnies and butterflies and caterpillars of a couple of weeks ago. What I did not know what goes on in those, that incubating cocoon until recently. I think I thought that incubating process in a cocoon went something like this, that at some point this caterpillar who's all fattened up, and he's ready for a nap, he gets wrapped up in a snug little cocoon, sort of like a baby in swaddling clothes, and then he just waits in the dark until it slims down and sprouts wings. That's what I thought happened. Sort of like an ugly duckling that becomes a swan, or a gangly teenager who turns into a grown-up by graduation, It turns out it's nothing like that at all. Inside that cocoon, that caterpillar turns to goo. Goo, right? The incubator in the cocoon, it turns out, it is just a mess in there. There are no identifiable caterpillar parts, none. There's no graceful butterfly legs or anything like that. The caterpillar dies. It digests itself inside the cocoon. Plan A disappears. And if you would break open that cocoon, all you would find in there is caterpillar soup. But then, with time and with patience and with the proper conditions and substantial help from the creator of the universe, something miraculous happens. That goo re-solidifies, and some long, lean body and the spindly legs and these leafy wings unfold. And when that becomes too magnificent for this dry chrysalis to hold, that butterfly breaks out of its tiny tomb, and new life. So that butterfly is not just a new, improved caterpillar. It is actually new life. I think the church as incubator is a cocoon full of caterpillar mush. And man, we are a mess in here. What we become next as the church is not going to emerge from what we have been before. God is not tweaking us. God is innovating. God is making us new. And so we are waiting because we know with time and with patience and with the right conditions and with substantial help from the creator of the universe, this goo will re-solidify. And when it does, when whatever God is doing with us, when whatever God has in mind for us becomes too magnificent for this church to hold, that new church will shatter our tiny tombs. And the resurrected body of Christ will not be some new, improved version of what we are now. We will be new life. Thanks be to God. Amen.